The air was a thick, suffocating blanket, heavy with the stench of copper, plasma, and fear. It was late 1944. The location was a small, brutally efficient field hospital carved out of the unrelenting tropical growth somewhere in the forgotten hell of the Southwest Pacific. This tent, barely held up by mud-caked poles, was the last line of defense against the jungle and death. Inside, the harsh, unforgiving light of a bare surgical lamp beat down on a makeshift operating table. On it lay a young Marine sergeant. His name, his hometown, his life, all were secondary now to the massive, ragged wound in his leg, torn open by shrapnel. A doctor, his face unshaven, his eyes lined with exhaustion, worked with absolute, desperate concentration. Controlling the bleeding had been one small victory. Cleaning the wound was another miracle. Now came the crucial final step, sealing the body against the relentless threat of infection. The doctor held out his hand, requesting the sutures. This sterile thread was the most essential lifeline of modern battlefield medicine. But then, the unthinkable occurred. The supply nurse shook her head. The box of sutures was empty. This was the Pacific, a theater where the supply chain was stretched to the point of collapse, where firepower was often abundant, but simple, critical supplies like surgical thread were perpetually missing or delayed. On this front, victory was measured not in artillery, but in quinine, plasma, and suture thread, materials that had simply vanished. "Find me anything," the doctor rasped, his voice rough. "Silk, linen, anything that will hold a clean line." Standing beside the table was Lieutenant Eleanor Vance, an U.S. Army nurse. She knew the Hippocratic Oath and the Army Medical Manual. All materials must be sterilized. All procedures must be approved. To violate that protocol meant deliberately introducing contamination, an act that could cost a man his life. But Eleanor looked out into the steaming darkness. Hundreds of wounded men were waiting. She looked down at her own legs. On her legs was the only source of fine, durable silk she possessed, her spare pair of beige silk stockings, a flimsy, unsterile civilian item absolutely forbidden in the surgical arena. This was the ultimate wartime crossroads, the choice between protocol and survival. If she used them, she might save this man, but she faced a potential court-martial for utilizing unclean materials. This is the true story of how one desperate nurse, pushed to the limits of her moral and professional code, transformed a common domestic item into the most critical surgical material on the Pacific Front.
To understand why a pair of silk stockings became a matter of life and death, we must first confront the sheer, brutal geography of the Pacific War. This was not the contained front of Europe. This was a war of endless water, remote islands, and impossible distances. The enemy was not just the Imperial Japanese Army. The enemy was the jungle itself. The medical department faced a logistical nightmare on a scale never before seen. While supplies flowed relatively reliably across the Atlantic, The journey to islands like Leyte, Guadalcanal, or Okinawa was a gauntlet of U-boats, hell ships, and constant delays. Every bandage, every bottle of antiseptic, every suture kit had to travel thousands of miles through the tropics, where heat and humidity degraded equipment, rusted metal, and rotted packaging. The United States medical supply system, massive as it was, struggled to keep pace. In one documented incident during the preparation for the Okinawa operation, a single ship carrying 48,000 jungle kits failed to appear on schedule at Leyte. Missing one shipment could cripple an entire forward operating base, forcing surgeons and corpsmen to manage severe trauma cases with resources meant for minor cuts. But worse than the logistical failure was the chemical warfare waged by nature. The Pacific was a cauldron of diseases that preyed on American troops. The most insidious of all was malaria. In March 1942, the Japanese conquest of the East Indies eliminated over 90% of the world's supply of quinine, the only truly effective anti-malarial drug of the era. Suddenly, the United States military was fighting a global war without sufficient defense against its silent killer. American soldiers were hospitalized in staggering numbers from malarial infections. The subsequent scramble for alternatives, like the synthetic atabrine, was a race against time and a symbol of the medical department's forced adaptation. The lack of specialized resources forced doctors and nurses into an existence defined by compromise and improvisation. They improvised stretchers from canvas. They used rifles as holes for plasma transfusions. But the most vital shortages were those that directly compromised the sanctity of the operating room. In a jungle hospital, surgical contamination was a constant threat. Every open wound was an invitation to a host of unseen pathogens. The only defense was absolute sterility. Yet the very materials needed for that sterility began to disappear from the supply chain. Sutures, the thread used to close incisions, often made of sterile silk or catgut, was perpetually scarce. Without it, a surgeon could clean a wound but could not seal the body against infection. The body's own defensive line was left open. Filters. In the rush to administer plasma or blood substitutes, impurities could prove fatal. Surgeons needed fine, sterile mesh to filter large particles, but these were luxuries often left behind. Bandages. While general bandages were usually available, the specialized fine sheet wadding and plaster for casts were often scarce or delayed, sometimes arriving 10 or more days late. This was the world Lieutenant Eleanor Vance entered, a world where the distance between a simple mosquito bite and the operating table was tragically short, and where the difference between life and death was measured not in firepower, but in the thickness of a thread. In a climate where the medical priority was often survival, keeping men alive long enough to be evacuated, Lieutenant Vance found herself in a forward-deployed mobile hospital unit. This unit, situated close to the fighting, was perpetually at the end of a broken supply chain. The doctors she worked with were skilled and brave, but their talent could not conjure supplies from thin air. She witnessed firsthand the moral dilemma faced by the medical corps: adhere to the rigid, ideal standards of sterile medicine, or violate every rule in the book to keep an incision closed, an artery clamped, and a soldier breathing for one more hour. The stage was set for a confrontation, not with the enemy outside, but with the fear of contamination inside the very sanctuary of the operating tent. The question was not if the rules would be broken, but when, and what unexpected item would be forced into service to mend a shattered body. The answer would come from the most unlikely source, a flimsy civilian item that most men never noticed, but which held a secret of industrial strength: silk. Lieutenant Eleanor Vance arrived in the Pacific not long after the brutal campaigns of Guadalcanal and Bougainville, where the U.S. Army Medical Department first truly understood the horror of jungle warfare. Ellie, a young woman from a quiet hospital ward in Chicago, had volunteered not for glory, but for service. She expected long hours and exhaustion. She did not expect the sheer, crushing volume of the wounded, nor the catastrophic poverty of supplies. Ellie was assigned to Mobile Army Surgical Hospital Unit 42, a facility constantly migrating, attempting to stay close enough to the fighting to save lives, but far enough away to avoid being overrun. Their location changed with every forward advance, trading the relative stability of a rear base for the immediacy of trauma. This constant movement made them particularly vulnerable to the systemic failure of the supply chain. The surgeons Ellie assisted were miracles of adaptation, often operating under fire, using flashlights when generators failed. But the true enemy was often invisible. The constant gnawing presence of infection was a medical time bomb in the Pacific. Wounds were immediately contaminated by tropical dirt, insects, and humidity. Sepsis was more predictable than survival. The one weapon they had against this invisible enemy was sterility, symbolized by the tight, organized row of supplies. Yet, one by one, those supplies began to fail them. The shortage of quinine and atabrine meant that entire shifts of staff, both nurses and doctors, were regularly struck down by debilitating bouts of malaria, putting further strain on those remaining. The lack of reliable refrigeration meant that whole blood was precious and often unavailable, forcing them to rely on less effective plasma substitutes. The crisis point, however, was reached in the operating room. Surgical success was often measured by a single act: closing the incision. A clean closure prevented contamination and gave the patient a fighting chance. But in late 1944, reports across the theater confirmed a frightening trend: a severe, unexpected shortage of surgical sutures. The high demand for surgical materials, compounded by transportation losses and the sheer consumption rate in mass casualty situations, meant the supply of sterile silk thread, catgut, and nylon was drying up. They began rationing, forcing doctors to use fewer, coarser stitches, increasing the risk of the wound rupturing or becoming infected. Ellie recorded these grim statistics in a small, unauthorized notebook she kept hidden in her footlocker. She noted the growing rate of dehiscence, the splitting open of a surgical wound, a direct result of rationing thread. Every case she witnessed was a moral scar. The breaking point came during the preparations for a major island assault. Their MASH unit was suddenly inundated with casualties from the first landing waves. The triage area stretched for acres. The operating tent ran 24 hours a day, fueled by adrenaline and black coffee. On the third day of the assault, they reached zero. The last spool of suture thread was used to save an officer's spleen. The next patient, a young man named Private Rodriguez, had a severe abdominal wound that required complex closure. Without sterile sutures, the surgeon could only clean the wound, pack it with sulfa powder, and bandage it, a temporary measure that guaranteed infection within hours. The surgical team froze. It was a failure of the system, but the immediate responsibility fell to the people in that tent. The doctor, Major Henderson, tore off his mask, sweat pouring down his face. "This is a death sentence, Eleanor," he said to Ellie. "It's the damned regulations. We can't use anything non-approved. But if we don't close him, he dies anyway." It was in that moment of absolute despair that Ellie's training and her rural upbringing collided. She wasn't just a nurse. She was a woman who knew the strength of common materials. Back home, nylon and silk were valued not just for fashion, but for their durability, tensile strength, and knot-holding ability. She thought about the silk she knew. Military silk was used for parachutes and maps, incredibly strong, but too coarse for surgery. But then her mind flashed to the only fine silk she had seen in months, the personal items carried by the women, the silk stockings they wore under their service uniforms, a small, tangible link to the world they had left behind. The idea was immediate, terrifying, and completely unsanitary. Silk stockings were non-sterile, contaminated by sweat and jungle air. The medical doctrine hammered into her head screamed infection, amputation, death. But the simple, terrifying truth was this: Private Rodriguez was going to die from sepsis anyway, unless someone dared to close the gap. Ellie had to calculate a horrifying risk. Was it worse to let a wound remain open, knowing that it would become contaminated, or to close it with unsterile material, hoping that the small amount of sulfa powder they had could hold back the tide long enough for the thread's strength to prevail? The choice weighed on her. If she acted, she committed career suicide. If she didn't, a man was condemned to death under her watch. She knew what she had to do. The unsung heroes of the war were not the ones who followed the manuals, but the ones who broke them to save the man next to them. Ellie reached for her footlocker. She returned to the operating tent, her face grim. Major Henderson looked at her, his eyes asking the question. Ellie did not speak. She simply placed the beige silk stockings, the very symbol of her life before the war, on the prep table. Henderson stared at the fabric. A moment of silence passed, stretching like the elastic in the stockings themselves. Then the major, a veteran surgeon who had seen too much death, understood the implicit message. This wasn't a joke, it was the only option. Clean them, boil them down, get me the finest thread you can pull from that. The process itself was crude, desperate, and completely against every principle of modern medicine. Ellie quickly sterilized the stockings in the fastest way possible, boiling water, then chemical immersion in their limited supply of alcohol, a process that sterilized them only relative to the filth of the jungle, but not truly. The silk, though durable, had to be carefully unraveled, yielding several lengths of incredibly fine, strong thread. The material was rougher than surgical silk, but it held the knot. And when Major Henderson took the needle, he knew he was not just closing a wound, he was crossing a line. This was the beginning of the silk suture, a forbidden trick born of necessity that would soon spread through the most desperate corners of the Pacific, saving hundreds of lives at the cost of every rule they had sworn to follow. The fate of Private Rodriguez and the credibility of Nurse Vance now literally hung by a thread of contraband silk. Major Henderson took the needle, threaded with the crude, non-sterile silk. His hands, though exhausted, moved with the utmost care, a surgical dance born of years of training. He knew that the use of this unapproved material constituted a massive, almost unthinkable risk. But this was the Pacific, and sometimes the textbook was a death warrant. The moment he began to suture Private Rodriguez's abdominal wound, he noted something immediate and unexpected about the material. The fine strands of silk,
pulled meticulously from the beige stocking by Lieutenant Vance, were incredibly strong. They held the knot better than the ersatz materials they had been using to ration their meager supply. The elasticity of the silk allowed for the slight necessary stretch without immediately snapping, a common problem with low-grade replacement sutures. The surgery was a success, but the crisis was not yet averted. The true turning point was not the closure of the wound, but the 24 hours that followed. This was the incubation period, where the fate of the silk suture would be decided by the invisible enemy, infection. Ellie Vance barely left Rodriguez's side. She monitored his temperature, watched for the telltale signs of fever and inflammation, the inevitable result of using non-sterile thread. The tent was silent, thick with anticipation. The rest of the surgical team watched, fully aware that if Rodriguez developed severe sepsis, it would not only cost him his life, but could also mean the end of Ellie's career and Major Henderson's reputation. Hours passed. The patient remained stable. His fever, though present, was controlled by the limited antibiotics they possessed. The wound held. The knots did not slip. The strength of the silk thread, a small miracle of civilian industry, proved resilient against the trauma of war. When Major Henderson returned the next day, he examined the wound, his expression unreadable. He looked at Ellie, then back at the patient. "It held, Lieutenant," he said, the relief evident in the tremor of his voice. "The closure is clean. The silk held." The success was not a stroke of genius. It was a desperate gamble that paid off. It confirmed a terrifying truth. The threat of no suture was greater than the risk of an unsterile one. The story, however, was far from over. Necessity quickly cemented the silk suture into an unofficial protocol. As the general shortage of medical supplies persisted and transportation issues worsened, Ellie's trick spread through MASH Unit 42, quietly and without official documentation. Nurses and corpsmen became adept at seeking out and procuring silk materials. Since the Army did not issue silk stockings, this sourcing often involved unauthorized requisitioning or personal sacrifice. They began using their own spare uniforms, scarves, or other private silk items, sterilizing them crudely with whatever boiling water and alcohol they could spare. The materials varied wildly in quality, adding another layer of risk, but they were consistently strong. The ingenuity was not limited to closing wounds. Doctors and nurses began to realize that the fine mesh of the silk stocking could serve another critical, life-saving function: filtration. Due to supply shortfalls, blood and plasma substitutes sometimes contained microscopic impurities. A fine, durable mesh was needed to filter these potentially fatal contaminants before transfusion. The fabric of the silk stocking, fine, tightly woven, and surprisingly resilient, proved an effective last-resort filter when stretched taut over a funnel or syringe. It was a crude, unsanitary solution, yet it protected thousands of wounded soldiers from immediate contamination in the field. The true turning point was the psychological shift. The surgical teams began to view the lack of official supplies not as a barrier, but as a challenge to their ingenuity. They understood that their lives and the lives of their patients depended not on the far-off bureaucracy in Washington, but on their ability to adapt and violate the rules. The silk suture became a secret code, a symbol of defiance against the collapsing logistical system. Nurses would exchange knowing glances and trade valuable pairs of stockings for antibiotics or plasma. The most desirable color became beige or dark nylon, as the thread blended better with the dark, often bruised skin of the soldiers. The cost of a single pair of strong, fine silk stockings in the MASH unit was now infinitely higher than its monetary value back in the States. This practice, born of desperation in one small MASH unit, would quietly spread along the supply lines, carried by word of mouth and by the movement of personnel.
It spread to Navy corpsmen on landing crafts, to frontline surgeons on Leyte, and to field hospitals struggling through the brutal final campaigns of the Pacific. Ellie Vance never asked for credit. She simply kept a small private stash of silk and worked tirelessly, knowing that her initial act of rebellion had created a lifeline. The silk, which had once been a vanity, was now a surgical necessity. The moral paradox had been solved by the simple, brutal arithmetic of the battlefield. Survival always wins over sterility.
The recovery of Private Rodriguez was the resolution they craved, but it was also the beginning of an administrative problem no one in MASH 42 dared to report. Rodriguez was not just alive, his wound healed cleanly, defying the grim prognosis that awaited soldiers whose sutures failed or were absent. The silk suture, born of one desperate moment, had proven its efficacy. The official record of the operation contained a carefully worded lie. Wound closed using available standard materials. The truth that a surgeon and a nurse had used a civilian garment, chemically sterilized with dubious field resources, was too dangerous to document. It was a violation of multiple Army Medical Corps regulations, threatening severe disciplinary action, including court-martial, for the use of non-approved, non-sterile supplies. Yet the success could not be contained. In the pressure cooker of the Pacific War, where survival was the only metric that truly mattered, knowledge became currency. Word of the silk trick did not travel through official channels. It spread through the medical grapevine among the nurses, corpsmen, and forward surgeons who shared the common bond of perpetual shortage. Nurses began to arrive at forward units with specific unofficial instructions. They were not just transporting plasma and penicillin, they were carrying the secret of the stockings. Eleanor Vance herself became a silent ambassador for the practice. Whenever a new wave of nurses arrived from the rear, often carrying a few treasured personal items, she would subtly observe, then advise. The procurement of silk became an unspoken part of the supply chain. While official requisition orders demanded antibiotics and morphine, the unwritten black market of the field hospital demanded fine silk fabric. Soldiers recovering in the rear wards, eager to show their gratitude to the nurses, often offered their personal silk scarves or handkerchiefs, unaware they were contributing to a life-saving, illegal supply system. The ingenuity did not stop at sutures. As Major Henderson and Ellie Vance continued to experiment under the veil of secrecy, they discovered additional critical uses for the fine, durable silk mesh. Filtration for tetanus toxoid. Due to contamination and poor storage, some vaccines and serums needed an extra layer of filtration before administration. The stocking mesh proved superior to coarse cotton gauze in catching microscopic impurities that could prove fatal. Temporary ligature. When artery clamps or surgical clips were lost or broken, a frequent occurrence in chaotic battlefield conditions, strips of rolled boiled silk provided a strong and reliable temporary ligature to staunch catastrophic bleeding. Sterile field securing. The fine threads were used to carefully secure delicate skin grafts or large bandages to prevent dehiscence, something rougher materials could not achieve without causing trauma. However, the practice drew suspicion. On one occasion, a senior inspector from the Army Medical Corps, a major from a rear echelon base, conducted a surprise audit of MASH 42. He was a man of the manual, demanding perfect adherence to bureaucratic procedure. He noted the unusually low rate of suture requisition against the high volume of surgical activity. He pulled Ellie Vance aside, noticing the near total absence of silk in the unit's supply ledger. "Lieutenant Vance," he asked, his voice clipped, "where are your surgical silks? Your unit's consumption rate is statistically impossible for this volume of wounds." Ellie, having anticipated this day, produced a log showing the reuse of approved nylon sutures, a common practice they exaggerated to cover their tracks. She answered calmly, her eyes fixed on his. "Sir, we are committed to resourcefulness and minimum waste. We boil, we clean, and we make every stitch count." The major, unable to prove any actual protocol breach, left unsatisfied but suspicious. The true unsung heroes were the corpsmen and technicians who made the process work. They were the ones who managed the crude sterilization process, often boiling the repurposed silk over field ration fires outside the surgical tent. It was a delicate balance. Boil the material long enough to kill the gross contaminants, but not so long that the delicate silk thread weakened and became useless. They became experts in this forbidden, dangerous alchemy. The story of the silk suture is a testament to the decentralized ingenuity of the American fighting machine. In the absence of central command support, individuals at the perimeter took charge. The ingenuity of one desperate nurse, combined with the quiet complicity of her entire team, had created an operational standard more effective than the one dictated by Washington. By the final bloody campaigns of the Pacific, the unofficial use of fine silk or nylon thread was an open secret in many forward units. It never made it into the official medical manuals. It never earned Eleanor Vance a medal or a commendation. But her ingenuity had accomplished something far greater. It had subtly lowered the infection rate in severe trauma cases, saving lives that the bureaucracy had functionally condemned. When the war finally ended, the silk stockings were discarded, sometimes burned along with the tents and the memories. But the men who survived the operating cables of the Pacific, the ones whose wounds closed cleanly despite the supply crisis, carried the truth with them. They were the walking, breathing evidence of a battlefield solution born not of high-tech labs, but of a desperate nurse's willingness to break the rules for the sake of humanity.
Global conflict ended not with a single defining medical breakthrough, but with the quiet accumulation of tiny acts of courage. The silk suture never made the official history books. Lieutenant Eleanor Vance was never called to testify before a Senate committee about her innovation. She was simply rotated home, discharged, and returned to a civilian life where the greatest medical crisis was likely a bad case of the flu. Yet her story is a profound reflection on the true nature of resourcefulness in wartime. It is a story that forces us to question the rigid authority of bureaucracy in the face of human necessity. The Army Medical Corps was a system built on order, protocol, and the perfect certainty of sterile supplies. But the Pacific Theater was chaos, a hostile environment where the perfect enemy was the microbe, and the perfect solution was often the unthinkable improvisation. Ellie Vance's legacy is not about the material she used, but the choice she made. She chose impact over obedience. She chose the certainty of an unsterile closure, backed by the prayer of sulfa powder, over the absolute certainty of death by a failed open wound. This choice saved lives, but it also placed her squarely in violation of her oath. The men whose lives were saved by that illegal, unspoken protocol became the living testament to her courage. They walked away from the war with physical scars closed by the thread of a desperate nurse's sheer ingenuity. They didn't know the thread was made from a stocking, but they knew they survived. In the years after the war, Ellie never spoke of the silk suture. She returned to her career always known for her efficiency and her quiet, intense focus on the welfare of her patients.
She carried the secret with her, a heavy burden of moral compromise, yet one that resulted in genuine good. Her story teaches us that the greatest acts of heroism often take place far from the battlefield, in the cramped, airless space between desperate necessity and unforgiving rules. It reminds us that humanity's greatest strength is its capacity for adaptation and its willingness to look at common things, like a pair of sheer stockings, and see not a domestic item, but a critical lifeline. Her work echoed the philosophy of many unsung heroes. When the system fails, the responsibility for the human being defaults to the individual. She proved that genuine care transcends bureaucracy, that sometimes the only way to adhere to the spirit of the law is to bravely violate the letter of the law. The silk thread was not sterile, but her intention was pure. It was that purity of intent, that desperate commitment to save the man on the table, that closed the wound and ultimately became her true, unspoken legacy.
The story of the silk suture is a testament to the fact that wars are won not just by the technology created in labs, but by the desperate brilliance found in the field. Lieutenant Eleanor Vance, the thousands of nurses like her, and the uncounted corpsmen who carried this secret protocol all proved that human ingenuity is the final unbreakable link in any supply chain. They chose courage over compliance, and in doing so, they left behind a legacy more profound than any medal, the quiet, undeniable truth that sometimes the most humane act a person can commit is to break every rule in the book. The silk thread was unsterile, but it was strong enough to mend a soldier, and strong enough to challenge the very definition of service. We encourage you to remember these unsung heroes, the fixers, the improvisers, the rule breakers who saved lives behind the front lines. Their stories teach us that when facing impossible odds, the difference between failure and survival often lies in questioning what is forbidden.
What is your take on this moral dilemma? Would you have risked your career to break protocol and save a life? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of ingenuity and quiet courage resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel to keep the legacy of the unsung heroes alive. Your support ensures that these vital, forgotten chapters of history are always brought to light.